For those of you who are already on, welcome. We're going to give just a minute to let a couple of the stragglers on, and we'll be starting in, let's say, 45 seconds. Okay, welcome to another installment of Upheaval Management. Today you get a special treat, a sneak peek at the keynote for our Fall Elevate Summit. Her name is Jennifer Fondrevay, and I will be more than honored to introduce her in just a couple seconds. But before we get going, I'd like to just remind everybody, our Elevate Summit for Entrepreneurs is coming up fast. As a matter of fact, in 5 days, early registration opens. Amy, our colleague, is going to put a link in the chat box. You can actually register today for a notification to ensure that you don't miss your chance to register at the early bird pricing. Again, early bird registration opens up in 5 days. Check the chat box for your link and get yourself signed up today so that you don't miss it. All right, with that out of the way, please let me introduce Jennifer Fondrevay. She is a dear friend of mine. I actually met her at a Alliance of M&A Advisors conference several years ago. She captivated my interest with a book that she was writing about, and we ended up spending a great number of hours talking about her book and her experience in living through the M&A process, and became friends, kept communicating for the years since. She's been doing the circuit, promoting her book. She's an educational speaker. She owns and founded Day One Ready, a consultancy that advises forward-thinking business leaders, and is known as a M&A survivor. We'll learn more about that later, so please join me in welcoming Jennifer Fondrevay. I'll be facilitating. My name is Jason Tzinkowicz, and I work with Blue Sky Business Resources, a full life cycle firm that supports businesses from inception all the way through a liquidity event at exit. With that said, let's get straight into the conversation here. So Jennifer, I kind of teased off the idea that you're an M&A survivor. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure, and it's so great to be with you, Jason. When I think about, I think that was 2.5 years ago that we met when I was researching my book. So to see what you've done in this space, and now to have a book, I'm really excited about. But to give some context for M&A Survivor, for me, that's what started it all. I went through 3 multi-billion-dollar acquisitions, and I survived each one. And they were multi-billion-dollar acquisitions. So the fact that I use the term survivor is there was just a lot of upheaval and a lot of change. And my belief after the third M&A deal that I experienced, there's just got to be a better way to do a merger or an acquisition where the deal is successful. You know, as you and I have talked about in the past, 70 to 90% is a percentage used to say that they've not done or have not succeeded in achieving their valuation in year one. I can say I experienced that personally. So I survived it, but thought this can be done. A success can be achieved, and so that's why I started on the Odyssey when we met. That's the Odyssey I was on, was writing a survivor's handbook, how to make it so that executives know what to expect, and that individuals can do better through M&A so that success can be achieved. I feel like I should get one of those T-shirts. You know, I survived the whatever ride at Six Flags. You know, I survived M&A. I just wrote a book about it.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'll get to work on making that T-shirt for you.
Maybe we can have that for the conference. Ideally, we won't have to have, you know, I survived the tidal wave, but.
Now you're talking. You know, one thing that I forgot to mention in my introduction, and I apologize, but there are both the Q&A option and the chat function in Zoom. So please feel free to send out your questions, your comments, your feedback. We will be keeping an eye on that. We would like this presentation to be more of a dialogue with you as the attendees rather than a presentation to you. So, you know, we'll be asking you some questions later, but feel free to jump in at any time with comments or questions. You know, one of the things, Jennifer, that I've seen you in some of the recent presentations and speaking engagements that you've been doing virtually is talking about how this crisis situation, the uncertainty of the pandemic and the economy that it's fostered, parallels with an M&A transaction. Would you be willing to just shed some more light on that for us?
Yeah, and I should be upfront. It's not that I was looking for it, but what's been fascinating to me in the M&A experiences that I had, as well as the research that I did, and even as I've talked to advisors who manage M&A, there always tends to be a, you know, focusing on the transaction, but then not really factoring in what happens to people when sudden change is thrust upon them, the uncertainty that comes with a merger and acquisition, and the fallout that can happen. The people piece is what I frequently talk about. And what's been fascinating to me is you have seen through this pandemic an enormous amount of uncertainty. We're still all faced with an uncertain future, and it's given, I would say, a lot of business executives, business owners, entrepreneurs. You see what happens to people when they're faced with uncertainty. When you're expecting people to change behavior when they don't know a path forward. And so what I have found is, and it's actually helped a lot in my advising, whether it's entrepreneurs, business owners, executives, when I talk to them, oftentimes it's like, well, you know, I know M&A has had a bad history of lack of success, but we're different. We're going to make this work. We have a wonderful culture. Everything's going to be fine. And what I've said is, well, let's just look at what's happened with the pandemic. When you are literally asking people to pivot and go in a different direction, you're asking them to change behavior. That requires a different kind of leadership. Certainly a different perspective in terms of how to develop the strategy. And equally, it has implications for communication. In M&A, oftentimes the comment is, you know, communicate. But I think there's too often people don't understand there's a cadence to the communication, when it happens, how it happens, who provides the communication. And we've been given firsthand examples of what's worked and what hasn't worked through the crisis of this pandemic, right? Which leaders, I think we all can probably come up with some, right? Leaders we see who have been successful, who were open and transparent about what lay ahead and what would require success. We've also seen strategy, when strategy hasn't been informed by the people closest to the work, how that has gone, you know, not as well as expected. And then equally, we have seen that for people to really change behavior, they have to feel in the communication, you understand how they feel, that you know what they're facing. And so there's so many, I think, parallels that we can draw from that will help executives, entrepreneurs, even advisors be smarter about what does this mean when people are facing uncertainty, to pull from that and consider moving forward when approaching a merger and acquisition deal.
Yeah, that's great. You know, one of the things that I talk with my clients about a lot is that reactionism is a passive form of operation. And, you know, in order to be proactive, everybody involved has to feel a sense of ownership because it's an engaged form of operating. And so, you know, part of being proactive, part of being purpose-driven and capable of weathering adversity has to do with empowerment and individual ownership. And that only comes through the cadence of communication, the strategic plan and transparency, and the leadership strength that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's interesting you say that, because I see the parallel with M&A as well. My counsel as the M&A survivor. I've also been called the M&A whisperer. Listen, it's kind of like, as a survivor, you have trails that you share from that. And I say, you respect people's intelligence. If you need to paint a vision for where you're going and why, because the more people feel blindsided and not involved or not considered in the direction and where you're going, then it takes that much longer for people to feel invested if they don't feel that it's relevant to them. And I think we equally saw that through the pandemic. If you make it relevant, and you also shape the path, right? Once both political leaders, government leaders, corporate leaders started to identify this is what's going to be required of us to succeed through this. If people feel as though you have involved them and you considered, okay, something I can get behind. And so, I think now that I've highlighted it, I know for myself, when I've talked to people, they say, you're right. I hadn't thought about that. There are a lot of parallels that we can learn from in terms of how you get people to change behavior, how you influence that positively.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that the fear component is something that we shy away from a lot in both M&A transactions and in times of uncertainty. We don't want to talk about what we're afraid of or what we don't have answers to. And by not talking about it, you're making sure you don't get answers to it. Whereas by putting it out in the open, taking the scary thing into the light, you're giving everybody a chance to take some ownership, to give some feedback, and to overcome. There are ways to deal with scary things, right? It's, there's either the, I'm terrified of this, I'm going to just pretend it doesn't exist, or this is a threat that we need to take seriously, but I know that together we can overcome it. And again, going back to that communication piece, it's how.
It's interesting. So I interviewed about 60 executives for my book, and one of the stories that resonates for a number of, when I've done my keynotes and presentations, but oftentimes there's a belief, understandably, with compliance and legal issues and confidentiality, only a certain small percentage of people should know about the deal. And so typically the comment I get is, well, you can't tell anybody anything. And I appreciate and respect that. But I think then that becomes just the constant, well, we can't tell people too much of anything. And one story in particular, a woman actually shared with me that she so appreciated a leader that she had because he was very transparent with the team. And he said, listen, our team, we were really important in the original company. I don't know if we're going to continue to be valuable. That I think we can be. But his comment to them was, don't focus on your title and the team you were on. They were research, but demonstrate how quickly you can get smart on an industry and how you can contribute that to the future vision. So his being transparent, respecting their intelligence, and saying, be opportunistic. He said, work together as a team, right? This is not every man for himself, but he was very clear. I don't know what's going to happen. We could survive this, or we may not, but this is your opportunity to prove yourself, but don't attach yourself to your title, attach yourself to your skill set. And I thought that was invaluable. And to me, when people hide behind it, well, you can't say anything. Yeah, you can. You can respect people's intelligence and give them line of sight on how they need to be smart. And that's, we'll talk about that at the Elevate Summit. But I just, to your point, when you respect people's intelligence and involve them in it and help them see, okay, here's some steps I can take, as opposed to just sitting back and waiting for someone to tell them what to do, which is unfortunately what I see happen a lot in merger and acquisition scenarios that don't go well. People are so scared and petrified, to your point, they're afraid that they don't take action.
Yeah. And, first and foremost, you had touched at the very beginning of this conversation about how uncertainty fosters, adverse behaviors. And I will tell every business owner, and I think, Jennifer, you can agree, when a business owner starts to consider an exit, their behavior starts to change. And the team that they grew up with is going to recognize that change. And if they see a change in the behavior of their leader and they don't know why, they're going to speculate. We fill in our gaps in knowledge with speculation, right? So
Absolutely.
I've seen that go sideways so many times. And the other thing that I always talk with my clients about is, you know, one of the first things I can think of less than 5 business owners I've ever worked with that have not told me that their team is one of the most important things to the success of their business. Now, part of that is because if a business owner doesn't tell me that, I don't work with them, but all of these business owners recognize the relationship that they have with their team, but they don't behave that way when it comes to the need to communicate and be transparent. They don't share that respect when they need to the most. And I think that could be said for times of adversity as well as times of a change of control.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because actually that's one of the reasons I call it day one ready. So in all of my interviews, what became clear is, and business, it didn't matter if it was business, smaller business owners or large ones, the moment you consider a merger and acquisition deal, you start to make decisions through that filter. And for small business owners in particular, I think they don't realize how much their team is attuned to how they react, how they think, right? So if they start to answer questions that in their mind, they're thinking, how would this affect a merger and acquisition with a company maybe that they're thinking about either, you know, merging with or going for an acquisition, their team starts to pick up on those cues. In how they answer questions, how they react to decisions that typically they would make right away that they then delay. All of those are examples that teams pick up on. And it's been fascinating to me because I think that's actually part of the issue. It's human behavior. People don't appreciate the impact and influence of human behavior on the deal scenario because it's so financially transaction driven. And so that's my sweet spot, because you can't anticipate human behavior and how people react to that. So absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up, because people then start to create more nefarious scenarios in their head. They think the worst. And it can go off the rails quickly.
Yeah, indeed.
They feel blindsided.
Yeah. I've seen it firsthand, and I completely agree with you. The human imagination is catastrophically more devious than any reality I've ever seen happen in an M&A transaction.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's why you do the advising you do. It's why I do what I do, right? It's the human component. I've had so many lawyers and accountants who do M&A transactions for a living who have said, oh, I'm so glad there's someone like you, because they often say when a deal goes wrong, we see it goes wrong because of the people piece, right? That they haven't anticipated the complexity of the integration, you know, the aligning of cultures. That's where they've seen the issues happen. So I'm, you know, I think, Jason, that's why we got along, because we see that happens and that there are ways to mitigate that by thinking ahead.
Absolutely. And you are so much more of a people person than I am. You know, the current statistic, for those of you who don't know, is that 87% of M&A transactions fail to achieve their investment targets in the first 3 to 5 years based on human capital issues, not based on financial statement issues. And so this fact that the due diligence process, it has historically been predicated on a quality of earnings, the sharing and review of financial information, and the legal side executing a purchase agreement, a definitive agreement that protects both parties in the case of failure to disclose or fraud or those types of things, misses the boat entirely on the biggest piece, the most critical element to success in a transaction. And, you know, the same thing that we're seeing, back to Jennifer's point about the parallel with adversity, the same thing that I'm seeing with businesses that I work with through COVID is that the ones that have a strong team, the ones that have that durable human element, are the businesses that were able to change course, come up with new products, come up with new delivery mechanisms for their products, and keep their team engaged and employed through the adversity.
That's a great example, right? The upside of the lessons that we're learning from the pandemic is those companies that were able to pivot quickly were because the teams underneath the leader saw the opportunity, right? They weren't stuck in, well, no, we've always just made liquor, right? We've always made alcohol, and you saw those things. I was just shocked at how many companies pivoted and were successful, but the ones who went previously made vodka and now make hand sanitizer, right? And so, but that takes a company culture where people understand the importance of agility and being able to adapt and not being led to this is the only way we do it and this is what we've always done. And so for me, I've drawn parallels with that as well. Look at that. Look at how those companies pivoted. What did it take? Because that's what will help through an M&A integration as well.
Yeah, the one point that I want to make on that is the tequila scented hand sanitizer right before I walk into church didn't go over so well. But so I'd like to. Oh, go ahead.
Nope. I was going to make a joke. Let's keep moving.
Fair enough. I'd like to take a moment to just turn it over to the audience and see if anybody has a COVID-19 story or a question relative to human capital and adversity and how that works, or anything that's come to mind just since we started talking. So I'm going to just take a couple minutes and look at the chat box.
I mean, I'm confident that people who have joined us will have each faced their own fair share of challenges, business challenges. I'm curious to hear what some of those may be. In some recent keynotes and webinars I've done, it's run the gamut. You've had businesses who have obviously just been challenged, period, with how to adapt and pivot quickly. Certainly cash flow's been an issue. Human capital, I think, is always kind of like, how do you get your entire organization to shift direction? So would love to hear if anyone's got comments from the audience about what they're facing or experiencing.
Yeah, also, some other things that I'd love to hear about if it stays quiet on the chat box. Supply chain has been significantly impacted, and your real estate could be rethought based on this. Obviously the office real estate, with people successfully working from home, in many ways is a great adjustment that we've seen. But how do people who have production style facilities, on-premise necessary workforce, how do you do that safely? What have people been doing? What have people been hearing? All right, we've got crickets. Oop, go ahead.
No, all I was going to say is I thought for the Elevate Summit session you did back in April, to me it'll be interesting to see how some of those business owners, right, who we saw were pivoting quickly and trying to accommodate, even having follow-up conversations with them for our next Elevate Summit, because businesses, so many have gone through such a cycle. And I recall in particular, I think you actually had a company that had been making alcohol and moved to hand sanitizer, if I remember, right? And so
yes, indeed.
Just seeing if that's something where now that's going to be a product line of theirs, or have they gone back, like where they are in their business and what they've learned from pivoting within this uncertainty. Because again, to me, when you think about a merger and acquisition, what looks good on paper, where you can define a strategy that says, hey, our company coming together with your company, us together, it will broaden our portfolio, it'll expand our reach. That can often look good on paper, but it's in the execution and how enduring that can be. There are parallels again with how you adapt and pivot and continue to adapt and pivot in order to keep moving forward. So I'll be curious to see how those companies are doing.
Absolutely. And you brought up an extraordinary point with the durability. I'm not going to use the term easy, but it's a completely different consideration when a business stops doing its core business to start filling an immediate and present need. But when that immediate and present need continues and the need to get back to core business coincide, now you've got a completely different strategic picture, right? And how does a team that put its all into a sprint to adapt now change their pace and go another 25 miles, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's been interesting because I obviously have been following a lot of what entrepreneurs have been doing in this space, and I give a lot of credit, like the entrepreneurs who have said, yes, I was a restaurant and they were going to go into a line of foods, and catering was a big part of their business. How they pivoted to become more meal delivery service, and they've certainly haven't been able to do the large catering, the large events that they were doing before, but how they pivoted in different ways in order to keep the business moving forward. And you made the point earlier, how they treated their employees. Those entrepreneurs who did everything possible to figure out, okay, how do I maintain, even if I have to reduce salary or there's no bonuses, but keep my team here in order for us to be able to take advantage when things shift again and we can move forward. Those entrepreneurs who, you made the point earlier, who had a team around them who felt invested in the vision and could pivot with them, are the ones who have been successful. And I think, again, a lot of lessons to be learned from that for those business owners, entrepreneurs, considering a merger or an acquisition, because your ability to pivot and have a team follow you is critical to success later on.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
Not that I would have wished the pandemic on anyone for us to get those lessons, but since we are experiencing a pandemic, I always look for a silver lining, and I say, there's a lot of lessons we can learn in terms of the leaders who succeed, right? The how you develop this strategy so that it's successful, and how you communicate in a way that has people invested in the mission.
Absolutely. And you've got to make lemonade out of the lemons, because there's literally nothing good about the situation that we're in, but that doesn't mean that we just sit down and give up. We as a human society, and especially business owners, are going to be relied upon to keep the rest of society moving forward. And like you said, there's always an opportunity to make something good out of tragedy. I'm going to take a quick breath here. We are at the halfway point of our conversation, and I wanted to just let you all know about something really exciting. The lovely and very talented Jennifer Fondrevay is going to be working her signing hand to the bones to give us 50 autographed copies of her brand new book that we can give away to the first 50 registrants for the Elevate Summit coming up in November.
It's a real book. That's it.
Look at that.
Now what? A survivor's guide for thriving through mergers and acquisitions.
And I'm going to tell you.
I should say, for anyone who's part of this listening in now or later, most people will be like, a book on mergers and acquisitions? How boring can that be? We'll assume it's about some, deal making insights. Well, no, this is illustrated. So I always highlight, it's got personalities I bring to life, like the dominatrix, which for those people who join the Elevate Summit, they'll get to find out more about the personalities that emerge when change happens. Because change is an inevitable part of a merger and an acquisition. So it's how people deal with change that's part of the insight of the book.
So true. And I can say personally,
characters.
Yeah, and it's not just the illustrations that are in cartoon form, but the verbal illustrations as well. I have read more than my fair share of dry analysis and mathematic oriented M&A books to be where I am today. This was not one of those. I found myself laughing. I found myself nodding. There were a couple times where I got up out of my chair and I'm like, that's my client. So yeah, I mean, just it's a great read. It's a lot of fun, and we are super excited not only to have Jennifer keynoting our summit, but delivering those books. And Jennifer, next time we can be in person together, you better have a pen.
Thank you. Well, it's interesting because I think actually, Jason, even when I met you, I was just researching for the book, but I hadn't planned to launch my consultancy. I was a chief marketing officer. I'd been in corporate, but I had so many people while I was interviewing for the book say, this is great because it's insightful, right? You have massive, large, I dealt in multi-billion-dollar acquisitions. So you have the large consulting firms that typically come in, and the small business owners, executives who I interviewed all said, this highlights the people piece in a way that helps you understand what happens to people and why behavior change happens and how to mitigate it and what you can do in advance in the planning to be not only prepared for it, but not to have the fear as much as you might because of the transparency. My intent with the book was to, as I said, my muse was, it's for the people who aren't in the room when the deal is made, but who are burdened with the execution. I wanted people to understand, here's what's going to happen, and there's enormous opportunity in a merger and acquisition. It's clear that both companies had to do it for success, right? You don't go into an M&A if you can do it on your own. So reminding people there's a reason why these companies came together. How can you make the most of it? There are opportunities, but you have to be looking for them.
Yeah, and one of the things that I get so excited about on a personal level is that I've been frustrated throughout my career as a business advisor that a lot of business advisors, especially the ones that manage M&A transactions, don't like to talk about the human capital side of things because they think that it opens up Pandora's box to potential deal killers. And so they just kind of push that cart down the road. And the neat thing about the way that Day One Ready and Jennifer addresses this situation is that it's engaging, it's proactive, and it's less threatening. It doesn't feel like, hey, we're going to talk about human capital to kill your deal. It's like, hey, we're going to talk about human capital to make your deal more prosperous. And she's been able to get the ear of the advisors that all of you are going to need at the time of a transaction, so that they're working for both the buyer and the seller's best interest, as well as the success of the company post-transaction. So I so much appreciate the fact that somebody's been finally able to break through on that.
Well, it's been interesting, and that honestly has been one of the greatest compliments I've received in writing the book, because I met a lot of people along the way as I was doing the research and interviewing executives. And I would have, private equity leaders in particular would say, absolutely, I've seen that happen, but they get nervous, right? They want to they focus on the deal transaction. But I've had a number of them come back to me and say, your book is a great way for me to introduce that topic in a way that helps people see the possibility, where things could go wrong and how to address it. And so they're actually very complimentary to say it's great to have a book that I can give to executives on both sides as they're coming together to say, this is what you need to think about and be prepared for early in the conversation, as opposed to, as you said, let's just get the deal done and then we'll deal with it. If you don't have that conversation early on, it becomes an even bigger issue potentially down the line. And so one of the upsides that I have seen from writing a book from a survivor's point of view is to say, this is what's going to happen. And they're not, again, because I interviewed 60 people, they were the same teams that emerged in multiple M&A scenarios. And that's why I think private equity in particular have found it so helpful, because it allows them to introduce that topic in a non-threatening way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, you kind of alluded to this when you showed us that cartoon in your book, but you have this knack for personifying characteristics within leaders and members of the organization that come out during times of adversity, if you will, or times of change. You had mentioned that these styles start to come out. You're seeing the similar thing happening with leadership styles in the pandemic crisis that you see in a change of control M&A transaction. I'd like to peel that onion back just a little bit further and hear more from you about that.
Well, the one personality that is absolutely always present when change is thrust upon you is I'm going to throw up my picture. Hopefully you can see it. That's the ostrich, right? Those people who are in denial. So we had a lot of that at the beginning of the pandemic. Do you remember when we actually were still wondering if this was going to be called a pandemic? Like I was just talking about that with somebody the other day. I was like, do you remember those weeks where we were like, I wonder if this is a pandemic? Oh yeah, and clearly it was. And so that happens, and I'm sure you witnessed it, Jason. You will always have people who are in denial. So we're all an ostrich at the beginning of change. It's how quickly you move forward from that. And one of the things I wanted to highlight with bringing those different personalities to life is that people react differently when change is thrust upon them, right? So one of the other favorite characters that people always react to. So this is don't know if you can see. So Those are missing in action, right? So those are the people who they're kind of out of denial, but they just disappear into the woodwork. They wait to see what other people do. They don't take any responsibility. They just kind of, become wallpaper. And what I highlight in the book, just for that character in particular, is you can't afford to wait for people to drive forward. You've got to be invested in that way forward if you have any hope of having success to move forward. And what was funny, those characters in particular, the missing in action MIA group, I can't tell you how many people who have, whether they wrote the book review or even reached out to me afterwards and said, I know those people. I don't even have to go through an M&A to have that experience with that. We've got a ton of MIAs. We don't do anything. But it is, right? And that can be even more aggravated particularly in a bigger merger and acquisition. You fall back into the woodwork. People don't know your value. They don't know what you can contribute to the new vision, and you can often, you'll lose your job. So you might think it's a safe thing, but don't do anything, but it actually can be worse for you. So what I tried to do with bringing those personalities to life, one, I wanted to highlight again, and it's been the theme of our conversation here, you can't predict human nature, right? Everything can look great on paper, but the one factor that's the unknown is how humans will react. Even, again, we'll go back to the pandemic, right? Here's what humans need to do. We didn't know if we'd be successful in getting through this pandemic until we saw human behavior. And you've seen, the amount of debate and discussion about wearing masks and social distancing, and those people who did it and those who didn't. And you can't predict how humans are going to react. I think where we saw humans take ownership and charges when you had a leader who was open and upfront and able to communicate in a way that people said, okay, yes, I'm invested in this, I'm going to change. And so that's why for me, the book was a way to say, when you're doing a seal, if you don't factor in that human nature is unpredictable and you need to just be prepared that this is an emotional journey for your workforce, the characteristics were just fun to bring to life. I know I have 10 personalities. Each of them is a personality. Someone I knew in my $3 billion acquisition experiences, all of them were someone I worked with or witnessed. So, and in all of the interviews I did with executives, they would always say, oh, I know that. I know that person. I have worked with that person.
So how many of the unnamed guilty called you for royalties?
Well, I actually had a couple of people who were trying to figure out who who I was writing about in the book, and I said, you know, that's not the point of the book, right? I could have just written my own journey. I went through 3 multi-billion-dollar acquisitions. You know, I had my own, but I wanted to make sure that what I wrote about reflected the themes of all M&A. So I said, you know, maybe once I'm well into my golden years, I will reveal who each person was. But it was actually kind of fun, and I will have to say it helped me work out a couple of issues with certain personalities. Definitely the Black Widow, you know, the know-it-all, the know-nothing. Those are all personalities that come to life, and that we will talk a little bit more in depth about during our Elevate Summit.
I can't wait. You know, Jennifer, this is our sneak peek at you. So I'm going to put you on the spot here and ask you to pull back the curtain a little bit and let our attendees hear about a personal story.
Oh, what kind of personal? How personal do you want to get, Jason?
we got to keep it PG. I'm young.
Well, you know, I mean, as it's relevant to this, and particularly because we'll have entrepreneurs in our audience. Now that I am an entrepreneur, I have found it just fascinating how important the culture piece as an entrepreneur, and now I'm looking at it from someone who advises entrepreneurs on, you know, when you're building the business and you're trying to get, you know, fast growth and all of that, you may forget the culture piece, or you don't forget it, but it's secondary. It's not something you immediately focus on. And I say, so my personal story is just the company that I first worked for, Navtech, was a digital mapping company. And that was my first big acquisition experience. Navtech was acquired by Nokia. And I loved that culture. Navtech was amazing, very entrepreneurial. We had an opportunity to create our business, really to build it and move forward. And so when that B2B culture, you know, was acquired by Nokia, which was B2C, I saw firsthand what can happen when you have two very different cultures coming together, and how to navigate that. So for me, that was frankly really the motivation for writing the book in the first place. That's when I had the book idea. That was back in 2012, 2013. And so I decided to keep the personal story PC and on point with business, Jason. So anyone who comes at the summit, I can share more personal stories, you know, bars I've been to, countries I've visited, celebrities I know. But for me, just that story in particular was the genesis for, I want to be able to help business executives, owners, entrepreneurs be smarter about, even if they don't have an M&A immediately at hand, but they're considering one, how to make sure they do it in a way that gives them the greatest chance for success, because there's a lot of variables that you need to consider that aren't just transactionally oriented. I feel like a politician.
Awesome.
I know
Thank
you wanted some really juicy personal story, and I went straight back to here's about the business, Jason.
The consummate professional, Jennifer. I appreciate that. You know, it's interesting. One of the things that we at Blue Sky Business Resources always talk to our clients about is run your business as though an M&A transaction is imminent, and that's going to make your business more durable to change. It's going to make your business more agile in adversity, and it's going to put more cash in everybody's pocket. And you touched on some points that I want to dig into here. You know, you had talked about this business culture, and I just spoke with a business that is very similar. They have that tightly knit artisan craft making culture, and every single member of the team feels like an owner of the business. They feel like they have a personal invested stake in the quality of what is produced and delivered under that flagship. And, you know, Just like in an M&A transaction, if a business with that kind of culture wants to grow, they face certain risks, right? All of a sudden, to grow, they're going to need more manpower, but that manpower isn't part of the family yet. And so you might have this class division and clash, and all of a sudden these artists of their craft are going to start to look at their product as a commodity. And so there's a lot of communication and planning and preparation that goes into a next stage of growth with a tight culture, in the same way that a similar planning paradigm can be used for an M&A transaction. Can you just dig into that a little bit for us?
Yeah, in fact, I've had a client recently. It was a family-owned business, and the son took over from the father, and recently sold to a private equity firm. And I've seen the adjustment of what that company is going through. I can't go into too many details, but it's a similar type of culture. You know, everyone had worked there for years, and for some of them, it was their first job out of college, and they were still there. And those are the times where, you know, private equity can bring that necessary infusion of cash and capital that's needed in order to keep it going. But it's an adjustment period. So there, the counsel I typically provide is you have to be very upfront and honest in your not only the valuation, but beyond that, what your year one forecasting is. You have to factor in that it takes them time to adjust. Because even if you say, okay, we're just going to clear out the talent completely, but you bought it for the talent, right? So you've got to factor in what's the true reasonable timeline to accommodate for people adjusting to, this was a family-owned business, and now we've got certain metrics that we have to hit that hadn't been part of their way before. And it's not to judge it right or wrong. It's just you have to factor that piece in more actively. And there can be resistance too. You can have some within the group, maybe this is what you're experiencing with the artisans, who are excited and they see the opportunity, and others who are thinking that's the worst thing ever. We should never consider anything like this. It'll change our culture completely. You know, all of those are factors to be considered. And that's why when I do my advising, I make sure to just highlight, you have to factor that in to your timeline. Because if you don't, if you make assumptions that thinks everyone's going to be so excited about this and they'll be on board immediately, you'll have a rude awakening.
Yeah, and you know, you just brought up another great point, which is communication is as much about active listening as it is about speaking to the team. You know, it's one thing to tell the team where you're going, but if you listen to the team about what they perceive the culture to be, what they talk about as important, it's a lot easier to say, here's the direction we're going, and here's how it fits with what's important to you. You know, a business can choose between price, quality, and quantity, but you can't have all three, right? And so if the artisans say, I don't care how much we produce as long as we don't sacrifice quality, then that's great. Here's a path where we can do that, but we're going to have to start nudging the price point, you know, things of that nature. If you're listening to the team and you get that voice first about what is important to them about the culture, then you have a much better chance of communicating the change in a way that they can embrace.
And it's interesting because one of the exercises that I do, particularly around when culture has been a big part of a company, I do a pre-mortem. So in that scenario, I'll have the leadership team say, okay, let's say you've made the decision, M&A happens. Now let's go through all of the scenarios, the possible things that could happen now as a result of this decision. And it's almost kind of a reverse SWOT. Think about what could your competitors do? What might your workforce do? What could happen globally or in government? What are regulations that may change? And it's not doomsday planning, but it is a pre-mortem is to assume, you know, The post-mortem is the patient died, then you try and figure out why the patient died, right? A pre-mortem is, okay, let's avoid that patient dying. What are all the things that could go wrong? And in business, it's, here's our decision. What are all of the things that could happen? What might be scenarios that we need to be prepared for, right? The military does that a lot in planning, and I find it's an enormously useful exercise. And that's when you actually find whether executives are really aligned or not. Because in that scenario playing, people would say, well, that's a good thing. And someone else in the group might say, well, that's not a good thing. That would be a bad thing. And then it forces some discussion. And to your point, I feel even though people are afraid to sometimes have those discussions too early, I have found in pre-mortems, it helps people have the discussion because it's a strategic discussion. You're thinking about, okay, what are the implications and what would we do if that scenario actually does come to pass? And, you know, when I have done those, the executives have inevitably said that was so helpful because now it makes us smart about possible ways that this could play out. And they also realize where they truly are aligned and maybe where they have a slight different definition of how something might play out.
Yeah, when I was, this is a way former life, but when I was designing and troubleshooting restaurants, one of the first things I would always do is create a crash kit. And it had all the things for manually accepting credit cards if the computers went down, tax conversion tables, you know, who to call and what to do if the power went out and you need to get dry ice for your coolers and freezers, all of those things. And you just have it in a toolbox in the office so that in the case of an emergency, you have a plan in place and nobody has to panic because all you have to do is pull out your crash kit. You know, the same type of idea is kind of what you're talking about. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on a adversity playbook or, you know, a major change mitigation strategy that businesses, you know, like I said, talking about running a business as though an M&A transaction is imminent, having that, you know, put up, you know, years in advance and, you know, maybe even doing some adversity drills with your team. What are your thoughts on that?
One of the things that I do, because what I try and emphasize is, even though I say, hey, human nature is unpredictable, there are certain things that we know happen to all of us when faced with change. One of them is the change curve. It's often called the change curve. I call it the stages of grief, because people go through a period of grief when sudden change is thrust upon them. They grieve what's called secondary or ambiguous loss in a merger and acquisition. And you've seen actually, frankly, in the pandemic, right? People are grieving a way of life that will never now happen the way they had envisioned it. And that's called secondary or ambiguous loss because, you know, when I talk about it in an M&A scenario, you typically have envisioned an amazing career for yourself, right? Your company, this is what I'm going to do. This is my future. And suddenly in an M&A, suddenly that future is called into question and you are mourning the loss of the exact path you had seen yourself going on. And we're seeing in the pandemic as well, people are mourning perhaps what they had envisioned for the future. So what I do in relation to that is I help organizations manage those stages of grief, how to get from denial to acceptance. Because you can't, as we said, you can't stay the ostrich forever. And you've got to get to acceptance. And acceptance doesn't mean you have to be excited or thrilled that something has happened, but you have to accept that it has happened. And it's once you accept that it has happened that you can start to see those opportunities. And so it's really important to get to acceptance. But the path to get there, you're going to go through, you know, from denial, you go to anger, and you go to bargaining, and then you go to depression, and then you ultimately get to acceptance. So in my book, I talk about those stages. And I don't want to call it necessarily a playbook, but I help people understand these are the stages, and here's how you navigate them to get to acceptance. And what the feedback I've had from the book, it surprised me actually how many people have commented on the stages of grief, because often you don't realize it. I know for my first M&A experience, I didn't realize that that's what I was experiencing. I was just like so depressed and I couldn't figure out why until someone actually introduced me to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's Stages of Grief, and they have absolute application for dramatic change. Kubler-Ross wrote it in relation to when someone is dying, right? Both the person dying, they go through stages, as well as the caregiver. You know, you go through grief because you're mourning the future that won't be. And so I use that and apply it to M&A to help organizations understand changes happen. Yes, you're in denial now, but you have to get to acceptance.
That's fantastic. I appreciate it. So we are at the 5-minute mark. I am going to take one more chance to invite any of our attendees to throw in some comments, questions, get your last nugget of wisdom from Jennifer before we sign off. I will remind you that in the chat box is the link to pre-register for the Elevate Summit. Now, getting on the early warning wait list does not automatically register you. It gives you access to the summit before anybody else. So you can go there, you can register, you can make sure that your calendar is clear and all of that, and then register in 5 days. You will get, as long as you're one of the first 50, you will get your own autographed copy of Jennifer's amazing book, and you'll get more of Jennifer at the summit as our keynote, as well as a lot of great information from many experienced practitioners and business owners. So we hope that you will join us. I'm looking for comments. I'm not seeing them. So Jennifer, I'm going to just ask you one more question of my own, and that is, you know, what do you see? I know that we've seen over the summer a little bit of an uptick in M&A activity in North America. We've also seen a little bit of hesitance in the world market to continue to enter into M&A transactions in North America. And now we're looking at an uptick in coronavirus again as fall starts to settle in. So, you know, look into your crystal ball and tell us what you think the next 6, 9, however far forward you want to look, are going to be for North American business owners.
Well, I think, and I'd love to get your perspective as well. I do think M&A obviously will continue to return, for better, for worse. I see it happening because some companies just won't be able. It's the pandemic has accelerated a lot of companies that may have had some weakness already in the business, and now the pandemic has just accelerated and magnified some of those weaknesses. And so you have a lot of businesses that, in order to survive, will be forced to pursue a merger and acquisition. And I don't judge that right or wrong. I simply think that the pandemic has accelerated that. Some other things that I've seen, you've seen leaders, particularly entrepreneurs or small, medium-sized business owners, who, as we've talked throughout this discussion, have led their employees positively, have included them in the pivot and the change, and you've seen those companies succeed. And that's why I said I'm excited to, you know, when you do a 6-month, how are they doing now? Because I have found that those leaders that have done that will do well should they have to pursue a merger and acquisition, because they pivoted well. You also have companies where they didn't do well. They didn't galvanize their employees. They dug in on, this is what we've always done. We're just going to wait for the pandemic to end. And that end has not come. And so their businesses have suffered dramatically. So unfortunately, in my crystal ball, I see both good and bad, right? Companies just struggling to survive and deals becoming more imminent. But the upside is, I do feel that leaders have learned from this and what it takes to get your workforce to pivot and adapt behavior and be able to move forward. So I'm going to focus on the positive and what we've learned from it. And that's why, you know, even up front, I talked about, hey, we've seen the type of leaders who have succeeded. We've seen the types of strategies that have worked and why they work. And we've seen how you need to craft your communications in a way that allow people to understand what the way forward is and how they need to act. So my crystal ball only sees so far out. I think, unfortunately, because I don't think you could see any further out, right? I remember even at the beginning of this pandemic, every M&A, whether it was a workshop or a conference or a session, people were saying, you know, here's what I predict, but who knows? You know, I could be completely wrong in a month. We'll see. It's unpredictable.
Yep. And, you know, just to build on that, and I know that we're right at the top of the hour, so please bear with me for just a couple minutes because I think this is important. The first thing that I want to say is if you find yourself saying, hey, I'm a business owner and I'm on the wrong side of that fence, it's never too late until you're closed. There's a massive disparity between the businesses that are succeeding and the businesses that are foundering right now, but that will lead to opportunities. There are partnership opportunities. If you have a competitor that seems to be doing really well, there might be an opportunity to do a joint venture that takes care of you in the long run so that you can have access to some of their best practices and you can merge. There are some opportunities to find the non-predatory acquirers. There's a ton of capital trying to be invested these days. So it's never too late until your doors are shut. And there's a lot of opportunity in this unstable time. And so even though there's a significant disparity between the businesses that were proactive and managed this extraordinarily well and set themselves as the top quartile businesses right now, and the rest of the business world, that is just where we're at today. And, you know, the first step forward is to recognize where you're at and to start looking at what your opportunities are. So with that, feel free to reach out to either Jennifer or our team at Blue Sky, and we can talk to you further. And we'll thank you all for your time and attention, and mostly thank you so much, Jennifer. This has been fun.
Thank you. Really, thank you so much, Jason. I enjoyed the conversation, and fortunately, I think we hit on a lot of key points that will be relevant, and a sneak peek at what we're going to talk about even more of in the summit.
Yeah, I can't wait. We'll see you in a couple months.
Super. Thank you again.
Yep. Thank you.